Oh, thank you so much for such a kind and generous introduction. It's an honor to be part of the Kestnbaum Visiting Writing Series. I've looked at the past visitors and I feel humbled and a little bit afraid to be taking part in such a great tradition. But thank you for welcoming me. Thank you also to the University Creative Writing Program. And this room is really sort of amazing. When I walked in, I just thought there was really no reason to spoil this room with a reading. We could just sort of stand and point and probably feel better than how I'm going to make you feel now. I will read about half of a story. The stories are a little too long to read. You would be in a puddle of exhaustion at the end if I made you sit here through a whole one. But I think there'll be questions afterwards, so I'll read for a little while, and then I'd really be happy to take your questions. This is a story from my latest book, Leaving the Sea. It's called The Loyalty Protocol. Can everybody hear me? The phone call said to come alone, but he couldn't just leave them. Perhaps they'd been called too and didn't remember the procedure, which would only figure. His father was not good with instructions. Worse, his father was fatally indifferent to what people said. Other people spoke, and the man's face went blank, as if any voice but his own was in a foreign language. Perhaps his father had not heard the phone, or maybe he mistook the message for a prank and hung up. Later, his helpless parents in tow, Edward could explain the mistake if necessary. By then, it'd be too conspicuous to leave them stranded in the road while everyone else left town. Owing to the roadblock that would be set up on Morris Avenue, Edward parked at Grove and Williams and trekked through muddy backyards to the apartment complex. He cursed himself because he'd have to lead his parents back the same way, down a wet slope where his car would be waiting. In the many configurations they'd rehearsed at the workshop, somehow he'd not accounted for this major obstacle, herding his parents in the dark down a steep, wet slope. His father was awake and packed already, wandering through the apartment. When Edward walked in, his father started to put on his coat. "Where's Mom?" "Not coming, I guess," his father said. "Dad, you try. I tried already. You try if you want to. I'm disgusted. I'm ready to go. Do you know how many times I've had to do this?" "Did they call you?" Edward asked. "Did who call me?" His father was on the defensive. Had he even slept? Had he been up all night waiting? "Did your phone ring tonight?" Edward asked, trying not to sound impatient. There were cautions against this very thing, the petty quarrels associated with departure, which only escalate during an emergency. "I don't know, Eddie. Our phone doesn't work. I'm ready to go. I'm always ready. We're down there almost every night. Why not tonight?" Edward picked up the phone and heard an odd pitch, more like an emergency signal than a dial tone. "You don't believe me?" his father said. "I tell you the phone doesn't work and you don't trust me?" "I trust you. Let's get Mom and go." His mother was in bed, sheets pulled over her face. It felt wrong to sit on his parents' bed, to touch his mother while she was lying down. Standing up, he could hug and kiss his mother with only the usual awkwardness, but once she was prone, it seemed inappropriate, like touching a dead person. He shook her gently. "Come on, Mom, let's go. Get dressed." She answered from under the sheets in a voice that was fully awake and bothered. "I'm too tired. I'm not going." They'd been told that at times like this, old people dig in their heels. More than any other population, the elderly refuse to go. They hide in their homes, wait in the dark of their yards while their houses are searched. Often they request to die. Some of them do not request it. They take matters into their own hands. But there were a few little things you could do to persuade them, and Edward had learned some of them in the workshop. "Mom, You don't know what you're saying. You really don't want to be here, I promise you. See what I told you, said his father from the doorway. Tell him to shut up, said his mother. You shut up, his father barked. Don't ever tell me to shut up. Shut up, she whispered. They waited in his parents' room where he'd come and snuggled as a child 1,000 years ago, and he couldn't help siding with his mother. It would be so wonderful to fall back asleep right now, if only. Mom, if you don't come with us, who knows where you'll sleep tonight, or you won't sleep. I can guarantee that you won't like what will happen. It will be horrible. Do you want me to tell you what will happen? He could hear his mother breathing under the sheets. She seemed to be listening. He paused a bit longer for suspense. I could spell it out for you. Would you like me to do that? I have to say I'd rather not. Something wordless passing for surrender sounded. Edward left the room to give her time, and it wasn't long before she joined them in the front hall, scowling. She'd thrown a coat over her nightgown and carried a small bag. Okay, said Edward. They didn't answer, just followed him outside where the streets were empty. Where's your car? His mother grumbled. He explained what they'd have to do, and they looked at him as if he were crazy. Do you see any other cars here? He whispered. Do you know why? Don't act like you know what's going on, his father whispered as they trekked out. You're as much in the dark as we are. You have no idea what's really happening. None, fucking hotshot. Tell me one fact, I dare you. When they reached the hill and had to navigate the decline, his mother kept falling. She'd fall and cry out, landing on her rear end in the grass. He'd never heard her cry in pain before. His father was beside her, holding her arm, but she was the larger of his parents, and when she stumbled, his father strained and couldn't hold her up. He lost his temper and kept yelling at her, and finally, softly, she said she was doing her best. She really was. Well, I can't carry you, he yelled. Then don't, she replied, and she stood up and tried to walk on her own, but she went down again with an awful cry sliding through the mud. In the car, she wept, and Edward felt ashamed. This was supposedly the easy part. The gymnasium was crowded. A motor roared, which must have been the generator because they would have lost power at this point. They signed in and looked for their settlements, divided by neighborhood. This was the drill. Edward would have a different settlement from his parents, which he'd tried to explain to them, but his father had trouble with the terminology. It's not a settlement, he'd said. Okay, I agree, but that's what they're calling it. It's ridiculous. We'll be staying there for what, a few hours, not even, and they call it a settlement? A settlement is a place where people stop and stay. You know, people live in a settlement. Dad, I don't think it really matters. I think what matters is you find the area where you're supposed to be and then go there. But it won't be the area where you will be, am I right? That's right, but I'll be nearby. I'll be able to check on you and Mom. You don't know that, though, Eddie. How could you know that? When Edward brought his parents to their settlement, he could not get them admitted. A young woman he knew as Hannah had the clipboard. After scanning her pages, she shook her head. They're not on my list. They live in this neighborhood. He gave her their address, their apartment number. For no real reason, he gave her their zip code, the solitary zip code for all of them. In the crowd that had already registered were several of his parents' neighbors huddled against a wall. There were retirees from his parents' building, neighbors who knew his parents. This was the right place. He waved, but no one saw him. Hannah stared from behind her clipboard. He could sense the protocol overwhelming her mind. A street address recited anecdotally was no kind of evidence. Anyone could deliver that information. Edward was only a man talking. Do you want to see their driver's licenses, he asked, a bit too curtly. Not that he'd brought them. No, I want to see their names on this list, and since I don't, I can't admit them. I have the most straightforward job in the world. If you have a problem, you should discuss it with Frederick, but something tells me I know what he'll say. From under her shawl, Edward's mother said, Eddie, it's okay, we'll go with you to yours. She sounded relieved. That would solve everything, and they could be together. Edward looked at Hannah, who simply raised her eyebrows. She and Edward had once been on a team together at the beginning. She had seemed nice, very smart too, which explained her promotion. Unfortunately, Hannah was impossibly striking. He had been so desperately compelled by her face that he'd instantly resolved never to look at her or show her any kind of attention. Everything would be much easier that way. It was troubling now to discover that Hannah ran his parents' settlement. Was this how things were now? Had everything shifted again? It meant he'd have to see more of her and regularly be reminded that she would never be his. She would never kiss him or get undressed for him or relieve his needs before work or stop trying to look pretty for him, which was the part he liked best, at least when he played out futures with women he'd never speak to. When someone like Hannah, not that there'd ever been someone like Hannah, let herself go and showed up on the couch after dinner in sweatpants and a long, chewed-up sweater, it was unbearable. Edward knew that he shouldn't do this, but Hannah would have to understand. He broke character and pleaded with her. There's nowhere else to go. Can you please take them, please? Is someone really going to come by later and match each person to a name on your list? She hardened her face. She wasn't going to drop the act, and she seemed disgusted with Edward for having done so himself. Did they get a phone call, she asked. Even this question seemed beneath her. He started to answer, figuring he could lie when his father blurted out that their phone was broken. How could you get a phone call with a broken phone? I assumed they did, he confided to Hannah. That's the truth. Why wouldn't they get a call? Look, their neighbors are here, people from the same building. Why would my parents have been left out? At this last question, she looked at him flatly. Why indeed? They're not supposed to be here, Hannah said. You shouldn't have brought them. You might consider... She seemed reluctant to say what she was thinking. At this point, you've made a serious mistake, and you need to decide how to fix it with minimal impact on the community. She glanced pitilessly at his parents, then muttered, I know what I would do. Edward figured that he knew what she would do, too. He leaned in so he could speak into her ear. Are you carrying? He whispered, because if you are and I could borrow it, I could kill them right here, and it would be a lesson for everyone. She was stone-faced. That wasn't funny. There are people behind you. I have a protocol to run. Don't we all, Edward thought. But his protocol to keep his parents safe could not be achieved here. Okay, well, thanks for your help, he said, sneering. Good teamwork. Way to go. She kept her cool. So you want me to make a mistake, arguably a bigger one because you did? Let's say your mistake was an accident, which possibly it was, although I can't say. I'm guessing you're not an imbecile, although this is only a guess. You want me to consciously break the rules. You want your error, a stupid error if you ask me, to beget other errors so we're both somehow to blame, even though I do not know you and have no responsibility for you. How does that do you a favor? How does that help you? At this point, you need to fall on your sword. I don't understand what's so hard about that. Why was it so much worse to be shamed by an attractive person? Somehow he felt he could handle this critique from anyone else in the world. Just then the lights switched on in the gymnasium and a hush fell. Frederick, leader of the readiness workshop, walked in with his wireless microphone. Everyone watched him. He stood at center court, tucked the microphone under his arm, and started to clap methodically as if he were killing something between his hands. Soon everyone was applauding, moving in close to hear what Frederick would say. The drill, apparently, was over. He thumped his mic, said, hello, hello, and everyone fell silent. He was such a cock, Edward thought, an impossible cock. So, he said in his quick, high voice, fair work tonight, not terrible. We made okay time. Maybe we're a half hour slow, and I don't need to tell you what that means. Boom, someone yelled from the crowd to an eruption of laughter. Boom is right, replied Frederick, but it's not funny. The laughter stopped. We would have lost people, a certainty. I would have faced a decision, a certainty, even as some of you drove up in your cars. Some of you wouldn't have made it. You'd have watched us leave, and believe me, you would not have been permitted to follow. I won't spell that out. You'd be alone now, and it would be getting colder. You'd wonder how much gas remained. You'd wonder about the power grid, the water supply, the food supply. You determine correctly that you know nothing about these things. Nothing. You'd need a leader, or would you? Maybe you could decide things as a group. You'd start to quarrel. You'd divide. It would get colder. This is supposed to be the easy leg. We didn't even do the highway drill tonight. Do you know how much time we'll lose on the highway? Too much, the crowd yelled. That's right. The highway is an ugly variable. There's a reason we've not shared the details with you. The highway. We cannot find a way to speak of it that is not disturbing. Whereas this, Frederick gestured into the gymnasium, this you can control down to the second, which means I'd like to see us shave off that half hour, maybe 45 minutes. We need breathing room. We need to join our settlements without panic, with time to kill. Next time we do this, I want time to kill. Tonight we had no time to kill, and you know what? Someone from far in the back of the gym shouted, "What?" "I'm disappointed," Frederick said. He shut his eyes. The gymnasium seemed to groan. "But do you know what else?" Frederick asked, staring from his expressionless face. No one responded. "I'm proud as hell of you, every single one of you." Except me, thought Edward. He was pretty sure that Frederick wouldn't be proud of him. They broke out in groups for the critique, and Edward sat in a circle with his settlement. His parents, because they weren't meant to be part of tonight's drill, were dismissed. Since they had no way to get home, they were probably waiting for him outside. The group leader for Edward's settlement was Sharon, and she led them through the discussion. Everything was not well. Edward, she pointed out, had not registered, even though he was here in the gym. Explain that. Did he have trouble finding them? Was something wrong with Edward? Was he perhaps injured or confused? A check at the medical tent and then personal observation had confirmed that Edward was fine. Edward didn't register with his settlement because he'd brought outsiders with him, and these outsiders had turned out to be a serious liability. "It's as though we've never discussed anything. It's as though this workshop never happened," said Sharon. "We fought the interests of the group. In real life, this might have turned unthinkable." "I hardly think," Edward started. "Hold up, Eddie," warned Tom. "You don't talk during your critique." "What's a possible consequence for Edward?" said Marnie. Jeff jumped in. "I think we should do something humiliating to his parents. That's much more disturbing because he'd have to see them get hurt. I think that's a good punishment. The punishment doesn't fit the crime. It is the crime. I mean, I don't want his parents to be seriously harmed necessarily, but there's nothing worse than watching your parents, who are defenseless, get hurt in some way." Everyone laughed. Everyone except Sharon, who glared at Edward. "Okay, guys, I get it," said Edward. "If there's ever a real crisis, I'll be sure only to look out for myself. Don't worry, I've learned my lesson." "Unfortunately, Edward, this is not about you learning a lesson," said Sharon. "I'm glad your colleagues think it's funny, but this is about deterring others from suddenly deciding they can bring friends with them on an evacuation." "My parents aren't my friends," he said. "They're my parents. I thought they'd gotten a call too. I didn't realize some people didn't get called. Who here with parents still alive wouldn't have done the same thing?" Some hands went up. "Yes, Liz," said Sharon. "Me," said Liz, putting her arm down. "My parents are at home right now. It would never have occurred to me to bring them along." It wouldn't have even occurred to her, Edward thought. How do you get to that place? He didn't even like his parents, but he brought them along. Was that kind of thinking out of date? Had everyone evolved? A few people echoed this. They'd left their parents behind. Good for you, Edward thought. This could easily have been the real thing. Wasn't that the point? That you never knew, you murderous fucks? Does anyone think it's strange, Edward ventured, that our parents weren't called tonight? Honestly, Edward, said Tom, this is the second time you've spoken during your critique. We shouldn't have to warn you about this. You can't learn from what happened tonight unless you're completely silent now. I thought that what I learned doesn't matter, Edward snapped. Isn't this about you learning not to be like me? No chance of that, said a young woman on the opposite side of the circle, who stared at Edward so defiantly that he looked away. On Edward's way out, Frederick broke from a mob of admirers and grabbed his arm. Edward, a word. He'd never stood so close to Frederick, never had a private audience with him. As much as he disliked him, he couldn't deny how compelling Frederick was. Impossibly handsome, confident, with the figure of a small gymnast. This was a person for the future. What you did tonight was arguably brave. You demonstrated a priority for love and loyalty. You protected two fragile people who had no other savior, even though technically they were not in danger and would have been much safer at home. Technically, we may have decided that they were a danger to you, and yet you went to them anyway, endangering everyone else. You made a choice, and on the individual level, that choice was courageous and selfless, even if at the level of the group you risked our entire operation. If those had been my parents, may they rest in peace, and I didn't have my years of training, and I also didn't have sophisticated instincts and survival habits, it's possible I would have done the exact same thing. In other words, if I were you and knew next to nothing about how to keep people alive today, tomorrow, and the next day, I might have brought my parents here tonight as well. It's completely possible. It's precisely because I can relate, however abstractly, to what you did, that you won't see any lenience from me, not a trace. On the contrary, you will meet great resistance from me, and if you do anything like that again, I promise I will hurt you. But I want you to know face to face how much I admire you. When he got outside, his mother was asleep in the car, his father leaning on the door. "I bet you're expecting an apology from me," said his father. Edward was tired. He said that he wasn't, that he only wanted to get home. He had a big day tomorrow. "Because I didn't do anything wrong," his father continued. "I know that, Dad. It doesn't really seem like you know it." "I do. I would like to go home now, that's all." "Okay, go. You're the one who screwed up anyway. We don't need your help. You should be ashamed of yourself. Go straight home. Your mother and I will walk." "You're not going to walk." "Catherine, Catherine," his father shouted into the car, banging on the window. "Wake up. We have to walk home. Eddie refuses to drive us." "Dad, get in, please. I'm driving you home. Don't worry." "Because we wouldn't want to put you out." They waited in the line of cars, revving to leave the high school parking lot. Some people took these evening drills, hellish and deeply pointless as they were, as valuable social encounters. So Edward and his parents sat in traffic, his mother asleep, his father grinding his teeth, while athletically attired settlement leaders strolled up to cars and leaned against drivers' windows, chatting it out, running the drill backward, doing the blow-by-blow, reliving the night, because the crisis protocol training was all they damn well had in their lives. Edward didn't dare honk. These glad-handing, semi-professional tragedy consumers would turn on him, attack the car, eat his face. Or worse, they'd stare at him and start to hate him slightly more if that were possible. His father, on the other hand, hadn't noticed that they weren't moving. "That Hannah is a Nazi cunt," his father said. "Dad, you can't say things like that about people." "She's a Nazi cunt with a tiny cock." "Okay, Dad." "What, you don't agree? You don't like her either. Tell me you don't agree." "I don't agree. She's in a tough position. She's just doing her job." That set him off. Just doing her job? Gandhi was just doing his job. Gandhi? Not Gandhi. That other one. His father was in a rage. Which other one? Hitler? The one with the stick, with the blowtorch that reaches across fields, down into bunkers. The one who had that huge set of keys, like 1,000 keys on that goddamn monstrous keychain. The one with the small gun they have in the museum in D.C. Mussolini, he guessed. "Fuck you," his father yelled. "Goddamn amateur." Edward locked the doors of the car. "I'm not sure I know who you're talking about," Edward responded carefully, "but I know what you mean. You really don't like Hannah. I get it." "Bullshit. You know exactly who I'm talking about. You learned about him in school. I remember you coming home one day saying you wanted to be this motherfucker, this dictator for Halloween. Imagine how your mother reacted to that." His mother. If this had really happened, how would she have reacted? She probably would have cheerfully gone along with it, fitting little Eddie with a large key ring and a blowtorch, sending him off into the neighborhood to gather candy. At the moment, though, his mother had the right idea. She was snoring softly in the back seat.